Today, I'm going to share 3 true stories where the facts in these stories are so bizarre, people today are still trying to explain them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, when the like button tries to tell you something really important, just constantly interrupt them every few seconds. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Around 8 p.m. on April 25th, 1977, a 31-year-old man named Apolinario Souza Correa poured water on the campfire that he had built with his 3 brothers, Firmino, Aleriano, and Jose, on the beach of a small, uninhabited island in northeast Brazil. The island was called Crab Island, and Apolinario and his family would take their boat there all the time because they would harvest lumber that they would then sell to local construction workers. Now, when they would go out to Crab Island, pretty much every single time, there was nobody else on this island. It was all theirs. But there was a specific reason for that. It was because most of their neighbors thought that Crab Island was haunted. People who visited the island would often report hearing these strange voices coming from the forest, in particular at night, even though nobody lived on this island. And then sometimes people even saw lights flashing over the treetops. But Apolinario and his brothers made really good money by going out to Crab Island. And also, they just were not afraid of the stories people told. They thought they were all made up. And so today, they had arrived at Crab Island during high tide, which had been at about 12 p.m., and then they had spent the entire afternoon chopping down trees. But that didn't concern them, because they really hadn't planned to immediately sail back home. They had planned to actually have dinner on the island after they were done working, and then maybe sleep for a few hours actually on their boat while it was out on the mud. And then while they were sleeping for a few hours, the tide would come back in again. It would raise their boat up, they would wake up, and they'd be ready to sail home at that point. And so that's what they did. They had this long day of work. They had their dinner by the campfire. And then after Apolinario put out the fire, he and his brothers waded into the mud over towards their boat, which was literally sitting, low tide on the mud. And they climbed on board, they walked into the main cabin, they laid down their sleeping pads, and it didn't take long for them all to fall asleep. Now, Apolinario and his brothers had only intended to sleep until about midnight. But when Apolinario woke back up again, although it was still dark in the cabin, he looked out the tiny window and he saw that the sky outside was already pink from the sunrise. And when he saw this, he groaned because he knew they had overslept and had missed high tide. Basically, their boat had gone back up and then back down into the mud, and now they were stuck again and would have to wait likely until noon to finally be able to leave. So it was just a nuisance. And so at this point, Apolinario looked over to see if his 3 brothers were still asleep. Then he saw that Firmino and Jose were still asleep on their sleeping pads with their blankets pulled up over their faces. But his 3rd brother, Aleriano, his sleeping pad was empty and he wasn't inside the cabin. And so as Apolinario is realizing, his 3rd brother is gone, doesn't know where he is, he hears this just deafening screaming coming from outside on the boat, but not inside the main cabin. And so immediately Apolinario, he jumps up, he runs outside, and he finds his 3rd brother, Aleriano. And his brother was completely covered in burns. Apolinario was so horrified that he just froze because it looked like his brother's skin had literally been set on fire. And then he noticed something even stranger about the whole thing, which was, his brother, despite being so badly burned, his clothes didn't appear burned. It was like literally just his skin. Like somehow his skin had caught fire, but nothing else on him. And his brother is just screaming in agony, and Apolinario has no idea what to do. He has no idea how this even happened. And while this is happening, this sort of shocked moment, Apolinario begins to hear moaning coming from back inside the cabin where he came from. And so just sort of acting on instinct, he ran back inside the cabin. And remember, his two brothers, Firmino and Jose, their blankets were up over their heads, so he hadn't seen them yet. And so he runs in, he knows the moaning is coming from one of them, and he pulls back the blankets, and he sees the moaning is coming from Firmino, and his skin is just horribly burned. Like his skin is literally falling off his body, but just like his other brother, his clothes didn't appear to be burned at all. It was like just his skin had been set on fire, and he's moaning in just pure agony. And then Apolinario, he looks over at his other brother, who's also on his sleeping pad, Jose, and he was not burned, but he was dead. Now, unfortunately, because of the tides, Apolinario still had to wait a full 6 hours before he could get his brothers off the island. And so they waited until the tide came in, and then finally they took off. And then when they got back to land, Oleriano, who was the one who was screaming outside the main cabin, who had, burns all over his body, he was badly hurt, but not maybe critically so. He stayed behind with Jose's body, and Apolinario wound up taking Firmino to the hospital because his injuries looked like they could be critical. When they finally got to the hospital, Firmino was like barely conscious, like his injuries were really taking a toll on him. It was like his body was shutting down. But as soon as he was checked in, the doctors asked him like, hey, just tell us how you got these burns. Give us some indication of how this happened. And right before Firmino slipped into a coma from his burns, he was able to tell them that when he and his brothers were still out at Crab Island, he had looked out the window from inside the cabin of his boat when they were all sleeping in the boat, and outside there was this inexplicable ball of fire hovering in the air. And that's all he remembered. He had no idea how he actually got burned. So the police opened an investigation into whatever happened that night at Crab Island, and they would come up with several theories that, maybe could explain it, including that maybe the men had simply injured each other and were just sort of lying about it. Maybe they had taken drugs or were under the influence of something, and while being that way, they could have hurt themselves or each other, or just something could have happened that they didn't remember. Or another theory was maybe lightning struck the beach and somehow reflected off the sand, and bolts of lightning made their way out into the boat and, burned two and killed one. But the reality is these theories, there was no evidence to support any of them. In fact, the big takeaway from this investigation is basically that when they went out to that island, they found nothing. There was just no evidence whatsoever. Ultimately, the two injured surviving brothers, Firmino and Oleriano, they would make full recoveries, but neither of them ever could remember any meaningful details of what happened. And so eventually the case was closed without really any answers. But strange stories continued to come from Crab Island. People continued to hear voices and see strange lights. And then finally, in April of 1986, so 9 years after the death of Jose, a different crew of 4 men traveled out to Crab Island to harvest timber. And at some point, they all recalled hearing this loud crashing sound out in the woods. And then they all just fell unconscious. And when they woke up again, it was 18 hours later. One of them was dead, and another one was inexplicably covered in burns. And just like the brothers 9 years earlier, the survivors of this incident had no memory of what happened. This is a paid ad by BetterHelp. It's normal to long for a time when, connection felt easy and being close to people didn't take so much effort. And then you take a look at your life now and it just feels different, busier and more complicated. I mean, there are moments I think about sometimes, nothing big, just, sitting with people I cared about, talking about nothing. At the time, those moments themselves didn't feel important. But now, looking back, I think I'd tell that version of myself to cherish those moments as they were occurring because they don't last forever. And so someday, the relationships you have today may be the ones you wish you had held on to a little bit tighter. Therapy may be able to help you work through life's changes and provide the tools to navigate what's next, even if it looks different than it used to. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the night of June 12, 1993, 69-year-old Deke Slayton climbed into bed in his home in League City, Texas. And even this small action, getting in bed, took a lot of effort for Deke because he was very, very sick. So Deke had a brain tumor. He'd actually been diagnosed the year before, but had then quickly gone into remission, so he thought he'd beaten it. But it had unfortunately come back a few months later, and this time it was much worse. Deke knew eventually this thing was going to kill him, and unfortunately, probably sooner than later. His wife and daughter had been taking care of him as he got weaker and sicker. And while he certainly appreciated it, the reality is it really bothered him. I mean, he was a tough guy, and he was used to being the person who took care of other people, not the other way around. But more than that, the worst part of him getting sick was he hadn't been able to fly a plane in months. So Deke was like a legend in the aviation community. As a young man, he'd been in the Air Force and he'd flown in World War II combat missions, some of the most harrowing aerial combat in recorded history. And Deke had loved being up high and looking down at the world from his cockpit so much that after the war was over, he'd gone one step further, to space. And he had not just become a regular astronaut. He'd been on NASA's first team of astronauts to literally ever go to space. And then after he had gotten too old for space trips, he continued to work for NASA in various capacities until his retirement 10 years ago. But retiring had not meant he just stopped, aerial travel completely. I mean, he was done flying into space, but he still flew planes. In fact, he was a hugely successful amateur air racer, which is a competitive sport where aircraft race one another through basically an aerial obstacle course. And so now, as Deke's life was sort of slipping through his fingers, all he found himself wanting to do was just go fly. He had this plane called a Stinger, which he used for racing. It was this red, small plane that was super loud, pretty unique, but he loved this plane, and he just constantly fantasized about getting back in the cockpit and going for a ride. However, Deke did know that because of his tumor, realistically, him flying a plane would not be safe. His speech was shaky, and he was tired all the time. Also, his balance and decision-making were affected. And then on top of the physical limitations from his tumor, also there was the reality that his Stinger plane was currently in storage. But as Deke laid in bed that night, feeling just physically awful and, literally feeling his life sort of slipping away, all he wanted was just one more time to fly. And it just became so overpowering, that desire to fly again, that he decided while he was laying there that tomorrow, first thing in the morning, whether I am sick or not, I am getting up, I am taking my Stinger out of storage, and I am going for a ride. Early the next morning, at the John Wayne Airport in Southern California, which was over 1,500 miles away from where Deke lived, an airport manager stepped into his office ready to start his shift. He worked for the airport's noise abatement department, which was responsible for making sure that the planes that flew in and out didn't make too much noise and drive the neighbors crazy. And usually, this early in the morning, things were pretty calm and uneventful. But today, as soon as the manager got into his office, he heard his desk phone ring. And when he answered it, the person on the other end said they were a local resident and they wanted to make a complaint. There had just been a plane flying low over her house, making a ton of noise. The manager immediately looked over at the clock and saw it was just before 8 a.m., which meant that the plane that this resident was complaining about was in violation of the airport's curfew. John Wayne Airport had a policy where they didn't let any planes take off before 8 a.m. on Sundays, specifically to avoid this, to avoid bothering the locals too early. And so on the phone, this, perturbed resident gave a description of the aircraft, which was a small, red racing Stinger. And so the manager took some notes, hung up, and was about to, start making some phone calls when their phone rang again. And it was another resident with basically the exact same complaint. And then after that, this manager got more and more calls all about this red plane. And all the people who were complaining basically said they had heard it, they had seen it. It was like doing these crazy aerial maneuvers. but now it was gone. So they were calling sort of after the fact. It's gone now, but it was really, really disruptive. Some of the callers actually said that at certain points, this plane, when they saw it, had flown so low, they were able to read its identification number, and they had written it down to report it. And so they told the manager that it was N21X. That was the number on this plane. And so at some point, when the manager had a chance, in between all these calls they were getting, they looked up on their computer to see who this plane was registered to, using that number, N21X. And when they saw whose plane this was, the manager was shocked. This was Deke Slayton's plane. The manager knew Deke. Everybody did. And it was very surprising to him that somebody like Deke, who was a consummate professional, would be flying around so recklessly outside of curfew. That's crazy. So on his computer, the manager pulled up the morning's readings from the airport's noise monitors. When the manager saw the readings, he could see very clearly that at least 3 monitors had gone way up at the same time the residents all said they saw Deke's plane. And so at this point, the manager knew that because of these noise recordings, which corroborated the reports, that he would have to send, the legend himself, Deke, a formal note about doing this. He was basically going to have to reprimand Deke. However, based on all the reports and also on those monitors which measured the noise in the area, it seemed apparent that Deke, whatever he was doing, he was done doing it now because he was out of the airspace. And so, this manager would have to reprimand him, but there wasn't a huge urgency. But he would have to do it eventually. So the manager printed out the noise recordings, put them on his stack of things to do, and then just went about his day. 15 days later, that manager finally got around to actually sending that warning to Deke. And when Deke's wife got that letter and read its contents, she was so confused because what this airport was claiming Deke did was literally impossible. It would turn out there was literally no way Deke Slayton could have been flying his Stinger over the California skies on that day, because the storage location that was holding Deke's plane was actually a museum in Nevada. He'd given the Stinger to them 3 years ago, and it hadn't moved since. And just to make it clear here, they had removed the engine from the Stinger and then hung the Stinger from the rafters in this museum. This thing is not flyable, at least not quickly. But more than the logistics of how quickly could he get the plane out of the museum, put the engine back in, and make it fly ready, beyond that, that's a huge problem. But the other, far bigger reason that it was truly impossible that Deke was the one flying that plane, even though clearly it was his plane, the tail number said as much. The reason it couldn't have been him is because 5 full hours before that recorded flight, Deke had passed away in his sleep. No one has ever been able to explain how Deke's red Stinger plane ended up over the skies of California that morning. It just doesn't make any sense. And today, that warning letter that the manager from the John Wayne Airport sent to Deke, that ultimately his wife got and was so confused by, that letter actually sits on display at the Deke Slayton Memorial Space Museum. One morning in June of 1972, a hospital administrator named Harold Michaels ran down the hallway of the Alameda Hospital in California. He was totally out of breath. He was going as fast as he could, and as he turned the corner, he nearly knocked over a gurney, but he didn't even stop to apologize to the person who was pushing it. He just kept on running as fast as he could until he got to the cafeteria where all the nurses and doctors were eating before they started their morning shift. And as soon as he got in there, totally out of breath, he just yelled out to everybody to, "Hey, pay attention, I have a very important announcement." And so immediately, the room goes silent, all the staff, they turn to look to see what's going on here. And all he said was, "The hospital needs to update its disaster plan." But as Harold paused for a second to catch his breath and let this information sort of be soaked in by the audience, he looked around and he saw pretty much everybody was looking back at him with just looks of total confusion on their face. And Harold definitely understood why they might react that way, because there really was no clear reason for Harold to be suddenly barging in here and demanding they update this plan. There hadn't been any recent mass casualty events or, natural disasters or anything. This was just a normal day at the hospital. But here Harold was acting like there was some disaster at hand. And so There was this moment of like, wait, are you serious? Like, what's going on here? But before anybody could really ask any questions, he just said, look, I want to make sure we are capable of handling like a mass casualty event, an emergency. Like, we need to have a better plan in place in case something really terrible happens. We don't want to be caught flat-footed. And so again, there was like a sort of pause, and everyone's still looking back at Harold like, what's prompting this? And at some point, before anybody moved, somebody raised their hand and they were like, why? But Harold, he was like not having it. He just said, stop everything you're doing. Like, put your breakfasts away. I don't care what you think about this. Right now, go update the disaster plan. 8 months later, on the morning of February 7th, 1973, Harold sat around a conference table with the members of the hospital's disaster committee. They'd been holding meetings every month since the previous summer to update their emergency procedures. And just 2 days ago, at an all-staff meeting, they had unveiled the new disaster plan that Harold had frantically demanded. And so every doctor and nurse and clerk at the hospital had been briefed on the new procedures, and there was a drill scheduled for the very next morning to practice what to do. And Harold should have felt calmer knowing that they were now, officially prepared, at least more so than they had been before he demanded the update. But when the meeting wrapped, all Harold could focus on was this sort of nameless feeling of dread in the pit of his stomach. But after work that day, he still drove home, he ate dinner, and, sat on his couch and tried to relax, but he just couldn't. Fast forward to about 8:30 that night, and Harold was running out of his house, leaping in his car, and driving as fast as he could back to the hospital. He had just gotten a phone call from the hospital saying that he had to come back here right away. And when he got to the hospital, he saw there was a line of police officers directing traffic, and there were EMTs and firefighters rushing bleeding patients into the building on stretchers. I mean, it was madness. When Harold made it inside, the ER was bustling with nurses rolling gurneys down the halls and prepping extra beds and carrying these big boxes of blood packs from the local blood bank. Harold counted at least 6 full surgical teams standing around, scrubbed and ready to go before any patients had even arrived. And then at this point, a nurse grabbed Harold and told him that the hospital's phone lines had gone down about 30 minutes ago, but more than 100 off-duty doctors and staff members had shown up immediately when they heard the news, without even waiting to be officially called in. And when they got to the hospital, they went straight to their stations and knew exactly what to do because they'd all been preparing for that big disaster drill in the morning. And so as Harold is standing here sort of processing the scene, he watched as EMTs wheeled in a man with third-degree burns all over his body, and right away a team of doctors swooped in and guided him into a trauma room. And the rest of the doctors all waited in an orderly line to take over the next patients as soon as they came through the doors. And Harold couldn't help but feel really vindicated. And also a little spooked, because this was all happening exactly as he knew it would. It would turn out on that morning, months earlier, when Harold bolted into the cafeteria and told everybody to stop what they were doing and update the disaster plan. Well, that morning, Harold had woken up from this incredibly lucid, vivid dream, perhaps the most vivid dream he had had in his whole life. In this dream, a plane had crashed into the middle of the city, leaving hundreds of people dead and horribly injured, and it was basically up to his hospital to save people. And so that was why he'd been so insistent that morning on updating the emergency plan, because he felt like if that really happened, like in the dream, if there was a plane crash, I don't know if we have the capacity to handle it. Like that many patients all at once, I don't know if we can do that. And so we better update things right now. And so fast forward 8 months to February 7th, 1973, literally just hours before Harold's hospital was going to conduct a drill to practice the new disaster plan they'd come up with, a Navy jet had smashed into a 4-story apartment building in the middle of the city. But because of Harold's dream, which ultimately, prompted him to force his hospital to update their disaster plan, because of that, well, when this actual plane crash happened, Harold's hospital and his whole staff were ready. Initial estimates at the crash scene had predicted at least 50 people would die. But thanks to Harold's staff and their updated disaster plan, only 11 people actually did. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today's video is a collection of 5 fan favorite stories that are all about people who unknowingly walked into truly deadly situations, only realizing it when it was already too late. Now, these 5 fan favorites have all been completely re-edited for today's episode, so even if you may have heard or seen some or all of them, this will feel like a brand new viewing experience. Also, for all you longtime fans of the YouTube channel, make sure you pay close attention to see if you can find the secret image that's embedded in one of these stories. The first person who spots the image and comments what the image is and the timestamp of where in the video it is, if you put that in the comments section, we will pin your comment to the top of the comments section and you will reap all the glory. But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the like button's house, and for no reason at all, just kick their front door in and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Jacob Cockle always loved the water. He grew up in a town called Penzance in the UK, and he spent virtually all of his time surfing at one of their beaches. By the time he was 10 years old, he started skipping school to go surfing and started getting in a lot of trouble for that. But despite his parents' and his teachers' frustrations with him, there was always one person that had his back and totally understood him, and that was his older sister, Grace. They were so close, they developed their own special language they talked to each other in, and Jacob used it so much that people actually thought he had a speech problem. But when Jacob was 17, his life was turned upside down when Grace was diagnosed with a brain tumor and she died very quickly after that. This had a profound impact on Jacob. It was like his entire view of the world had totally changed overnight, and he began to believe that Grace's energy had been transferred to him and that it was now his duty to live for the two of them. And so what this translated to is Jacob began taking lots and lots of risks because he felt like he didn't want to pass up opportunities. He wanted to live life to the fullest, even if it was a little bit reckless. In addition to loving the water, Jacob also loved photography. And so with this new risk-taking attitude, he began doing these water-based stunts and filming himself in the process. Things like surfing in storms, or leaping off of buildings into fairly shallow water, or diving to dangerous depths on a breath hold. And Jacob loved it. He loved taking these risks. He loved filming himself taking these risks. And so he decided this was going to be his career. He was going to be a world-famous photographer that specialized in dangerous photos and films. And so Jacob got this big piece of paper and he put it on his bedroom wall, and with black marker he wrote himself a reminder: I will become a world-famous photographer and I will let nothing stand in my way. Basically, he was prepared to go to any length to get the shots that he needed to get. And this intense attitude worked. By his early 20s, he had won major awards with National Geographic and the Sunday Times. He was also a regular contributor to surf magazines where he almost always got the cover shot. Most of his award-winning pictures were taken of the sea in its most violent and turbulent forms. Like the shot of a fishing boat coming back into port in a large swell won a competition that put it all over the London Underground. Or this shot he took, which is off the coast of Sumatra out in the middle of the ocean, as Jacob and his friend are right in front of the supertanker that's bearing down on both of them, and his friend is surfing off the wake caused by the supertanker. So a very dangerous picture to take, but it won an award that was run by The Guardian. The money Jacob earned from these competitions he spent on improving his photography equipment. If he was ever given a physical prize, like a brand new TV, he would just give it away to his friends, because all Jacob was really focused on was going out and living life to the fullest and taking crazy chances and capturing those experiences on film. And one crazy experience that he had always wanted to capture on film actually took place right in his hometown of Penzance. A very strong whirlpool would appear a few times a year easier in a harbor that was right near his childhood home. It was just a quirk of engineering designed to keep the harbor from silting up. At high tide, the water would come in and it would hit this quay wall, and at the bottom of the quay wall was a tunnel that fed into this other pool. And so that would fill up with water, and then when the tide retreated during low tide, the water in the harbor would drain out and the water from the pool would slowly filter out back through this tunnel, pushing the silt and sand out of the harbor. But sometimes when the water came into the harbor during high tide, it would come in so quickly it would build up against the quay wall and it wouldn't drain fast enough down through that tunnel into the pool. And so just like in your bathtub, if you pull the plug when it's full, you'll see a whirlpool form as the water is sucked down the drain. The same thing would happen at this quay wall as all this water is being forced down and sucked through this pipe. It would create this huge whirlpool that you could see on the surface from the quay wall. And even though this whirlpool only formed a couple of times a year, it was so dangerous. There were caution signs all around the edge of the harbor and on the quay wall telling people to stay out of the water. But in his mid-20s, Jacob ignored those signs and he started jumping into this whirlpool every time it formed. And he was able to kind of swirl around the outside and he would film it inside and just on top, and he would upload his videos to YouTube and they would get millions and millions of views. They were totally beautiful and terrifying at the same time. On May 28th, 2013, when Jacob was 28 years old, he noticed that the whirlpool was back in his hometown and he wanted to go out and film inside of it again. And so he ran to his friend David's house and he asked him to, hey, come down to the harbor and film me inside of this whirlpool. And so by the time David got his stuff together and made it to the quay wall, he looked down and he saw Jacob was already in the whirlpool swirling around. David also noticed that Jacob was wearing a rubber horse head mask, and he told David the reason he was doing it is because it would be more eye-catching on YouTube. So David leaned over the wall and began filming Jacob as he swirled around this whirlpool in his horse mask making neighing sounds, and at some point Jacob stopped and he swam away from the whirlpool, but you could see the pull of the whirlpool was very strong because even with flippers on, Jacob really struggled to swim away from this whirlpool. But he was in good spirits about it and he was laughing with David and saying how when he first jumped in, he was actually pretty scared of this whirlpool. It's definitely the strongest one he had been in over at this quay wall. And David would say, yeah, I can tell from up here, that one's really strong. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, David and Jacob kind of joked back and forth about the strength of the whirlpool, and Jacob would put his mask back down and swirl around inside of the whirlpool, then get out again. And then towards the end of the video, Jacob yells up to David that he only has one more thing in mind that he wants to do with the whirlpool. He wants to dive down below and film it from underneath. And so he asks David to hand down his camera. David hands it down, and you see Jacob adjusting his camera, and then he dives below the surface to begin filming this whirlpool. And so David's up on the top watching Jacob, and he's very familiar with Jacob. He knows he does things like this. He knows he has a great breath hold. But after a couple of minutes, when he doesn't reemerge, David gets scared and starts yelling for him. And when he still doesn't come up, David turns and runs to the other side of the quay wall and looks over that railing towards the pool side, and he can see the water is still rushing into the pool, and there's no sign of Jacob. And so he ran back and forth a couple of times and he didn't see Jacob until finally he went back to the pool side and he saw Jacob down below. He was lying face down in the water. And so David ran down and waded out to him, but it was already too late. Jacob had drowned. The reason Jacob was able to swirl around at the top of this whirlpool and not get pulled under is because he had a wetsuit on, and wetsuits are buoyant. But as you go underneath the water, the deeper you go, the water pressure pushes against your wetsuit and it reduces the overall buoyancy of your wetsuit. And so when Jacob dove down into this whirlpool, the pressure pushed against his suit, he lost his buoyancy, and then he got caught up in the current of this very strong whirlpool, and he was pulled slowly down to the bottom. And so he probably fought as much as he could to try to get out of there, but he couldn't, and eventually was forced into that tunnel underneath the quay wall, and he was under there until he drowned, and then he was eventually spit out the other side. From a young age, Carrie O'Connor had an intense love of learning. When she learned how to read, her parents had to bribe her to get her to put her book down so she would go outside and play with the other kids. While Carrie loved to learn about all things, her favorite subject was French culture. And so she began devouring all things French, and then in middle school, she began studying the language, and by high school, she was nearly fluent in taking college-level French courses. Carrie would go on to earn several degrees in French, including a PhD. And in 2019, 2019, she put that PhD to use when she was offered a full-time professorship at Boston University. She eagerly accepted the role. After her first full year at BU, she decided it was time to get an apartment that was closer to campus. So, in August of 2020, shortly after Carrie's 38th birthday, she, along with her two beloved cats, moved just 10 minutes away from Boston University into an old apartment building on a busy street. With her apartment still filled with unopened moving boxes and furniture wrapped in plastic, Carrie broke out her laptop and enthusiastically wrote an email to all of her students for the year titled "The Joy of Learning French." In it, her students saw her passion for the French language and how excited she was about the upcoming academic year. A few weeks later, on Monday, September 14th, Carrie was back at her apartment building after classes, and she had just purchased a brand new piece of furniture that she wanted to haul up to her apartment. This piece of furniture was not actually assembled. All the parts and the directions were inside of this box that was 7 feet tall, 1 foot wide, and weighed just under 80 pounds. And so Carrie got this huge box out of her car at street level and then hauled it all the way through the front doors of her apartment building into the first floor lobby, where she leaned it up against the wall and then pressed the call button for the elevator. To understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of how Carrie's elevator worked. Once the elevator car arrived on your floor, you would slide open this big door called the hoistway door. And on the other side, you would see the elevator car, and on the car itself would be yet another door. This door is called the car gate. This metal accordion-style door would also be slid to the side manually, but unlike the hoistway door, the car gate had to be shut all the way in order for the elevator to move between floors. So when the light dinged in the first floor lobby above Carrie's head, she opened up the hoistway door, and then she reached inside and slid open the car gate, and then she grabbed her package and began trying to push it inside of the elevator car. The only way it looked like she could fit this huge package inside of the elevator was if she got it in there at an angle standing up. But no matter how hard she pushed and pulled on it, she just could not get it to go inside. And so while Carrie's doing this, another tenant happened to walk in the front doors of the apartment building, and they saw Carrie struggling, and at first he just walked past Carrie and started going up the stairs towards his own apartment, but he stopped and he turned and he just said to Carrie, "Hey, I don't think it's a good idea to keep doing what you're doing. That package looks like it's too heavy to be on that elevator. The elevator's really old and you might trip a sensor and it might start moving before you're ready. You know, we've had problems with that elevator before. It's just not worth the risk." And so Carrie, who's already pretty committed to doing this, she hesitates for a second and just kind of looks at her package. Then she looks up at the guy and says, "You know what? I'm just going to try one more time to get it inside the elevator." And so Carrie goes back to trying to get it on, and this other tenant hesitates for a second and then decides, okay, I'll help her do it. And so he goes down and he holds open the hoistway door with his hand, and Carrie goes inside of the elevator car and she uses her hip to keep open the car gate. And the two of them begin pushing and pulling, and finally they're able to wedge this package at an angle inside of the elevator car. And so Carrie thanks the guy and he says no problem. He turns and walks up the stairs and he disappears. Once he was gone, Carrie didn't press any of the floor buttons. Instead, she tried to close the car gate over the top of her package. But at the same time, a maintenance worker in the floor below her, which was the basement, hit the call button for the elevator. Unbeknownst to Carrie, the top of her huge package, when they wedged it inside, had pressed up against the sensor at the top of the door frame that registers when the car gate has shut. And so when the maintenance worker pressed the call button, because that package was pressing on the sensor, it tricked the elevator into thinking the gate was shut and secured, and now it was time to move. And so the car began to go down, but it only made it a couple of feet before the movement caused the package to slip off of the sensor, causing the elevator to stop. Carrie was most likely very confused how this car would have moved, considering the car gate was still wide open, but she had bigger problems. She was now trapped between the first floor lobby and the basement. But she didn't panic. Instead, she decided she would just get her package back inside the elevator car, and then she would figure out what to do next. The package, when it came off that sensor, had fallen forward and was basically jutting out of the elevator. So the top half of it was in the first floor lobby, propped up against the floor of the first floor lobby. And so Carrie turned around so her back was facing outside of the elevator, and she got down in a squatting position underneath her package, so her shoulder was up against the package, and then she began pressing it up as hard as she could until she managed to press the package back inside of the car. But again, the top of that package made contact with that sensor that registers whether that gate is shut, and so believing it was shut and secure, the elevator began moving down again. And this time, Carrie, whose back is to the opening of the elevator, she lost her balance and fell backwards out of the elevator into that narrow space between the outside of the elevator and the inside of the elevator shaft. Now, if the elevator had not been moving, she probably could have just crawled back up into the elevator, but unfortunately her package this time did not slip off the sensor. And so the elevator still believed the gate was shut, and so it kept on moving down. And so as soon as Carrie fell into this narrow space, the movement of the elevator would have kind of sucked her up into that space, crushing her up against the inside of the elevator shaft wall as the car forces its way down past her towards the basement. But the car doesn't even get to the basement. It stops once Carrie is pinned perfectly between the elevator and the elevator shaft walls. When the fire department finally arrived, it was too late. Carrie was already deceased. On Thanksgiving morning in 1900, an 18-year-old named Thomas Pedler told his mother that he was going out for a bit, but he'd be back in time for turkey that afternoon, and then he grabbed his jacket and his coat and he headed out the door. Thomas lived in a very working-class neighborhood in San Francisco, California, where, generally speaking, nothing big really ever happened. It was kind of a place where people just worked, and that was it. But on this day, something huge was happening in Thomas's neighborhood. The big football game between Stanford University and the University of California was taking place at the stadium in Thomas's district, and they were expecting over 20,000 people to cram into this stadium. And so Thomas was not about to miss this incredible spectacle, even though he didn't have enough money to buy a ticket. But he knew he would find a way to watch this game. And so Thomas leaves his house and he runs to the stadium, which was not far from his house, and he waited in front of the front gate where all these people are streaming in to go into the stadium. And around 11 a.m., Thomas's very close friend, Charles, who was also a young man, made his way to the front gate. The two met up, and at first, their plan was to try to sneak in with the horde of people that were making their way into the stadium. But even though they were still hours away from the opening kickoff of this big game, it was at 2:30 p.m., the stadium was packed. I mean, there was nowhere to sit, there was nowhere to stand. People that had tickets who were going in are looking around thinking, where are we going to watch this game? And so Thomas and Charles are kind of like, well, what's the point of sneaking in if there's nowhere to watch? And so they decided, okay, we need to find another way to watch this game. And so they began looking around, and they noticed there was a huge fence that lined the perimeter of this stadium. And they saw there were some people kind of climbed up on this fence trying to get a view down onto the field. And pretty quickly, when Thomas and Charles decided they would try to do that too, they saw that all the good spots on this fence were already taken. The spots that were open provided no view onto the field. And so that option as well didn't work. And so Thomas and Charles are frustrated. They're starting to worry that they will not see this big game. But when they walked back over to the front gates of the stadium, they happened to notice across the street was this group of people rushing over to this big white brick factory building. And they were literally placing ladders up against the sides of this building and beginning to climb up it. I mean, this is a 5-story building, and they are just basically free climbing the windows and the fire escapes. And Thomas and Charles realized that the top of this factory was flat and provided a perfect view down onto the field. And so all these people, they're trying to get a good seat to watch this game. And so without any hesitation, Thomas and Charles decide they're going to do that too. So they left the stadium, they ran across the street, and they began climbing up the ladders and climbing the windows and the fire escapes until finally they made it onto the roof, 55 feet off the ground. And when they got up there, there wasn't that many people. And so Thomas and Charles were able to run right over to the front edge of this building and claim a spot with an absolutely perfect view of the game. A couple of hours later, at 2:30 p.m., when the game actually started, the rooftop that Thomas and Charles were on was now completely packed with people. Hundreds of people have climbed up onto this factory. There were some factory workers down below telling people, do not do this. Do not climb on top of this factory. It's not safe. But nobody listened to them, and the police either didn't notice this was happening or they didn't care. And so there's all these people that are on this roof. They're all super excited, and the game has begun. It's 2:30, and as soon as the game started, it was like the crowd in the stadium, which could be heard very easily from this rooftop, just kind of erupted, and there were all these bands playing in the stadium. I mean, it was chaos down below, and it really caught on the roof. All these guys, including Thomas and Charles, they're getting amped about this game. They're singing, they're chanting, they're screaming, they're yelling. I mean, it's total chaos, and Thomas and Charles loved it. But about 20 minutes into the game, as Thomas and Charles are enjoying themselves and the crowd is still going wild, a dull cracking sound could be heard coming from one side of this roof. And so Thomas and Charles, they kind of spun around to see where this cracking sound had come from. And when they began looking out across the sea of people, they noticed on the far side of the roof where the sound had kind of come from, they could see people scrambling to get off the roof. But before Thomas and Charles and the other people around them who were watching this happening could figure out what was going on, there was a much louder cracking sound, and suddenly the floor underneath Thomas, Charles, and everybody else collapsed. And immediately, people on this roof fell all the way to the bottom of this factory, 55 feet below. There weren't loads of floors inside of this factory. Instead, it was basically just one big building, 55 feet high, that housed this brick structure right in the center of the factory that was almost as tall as the entire factory. It was almost like the factory was a shell around this brick smaller structure right in the middle that was like 40 feet tall. And so after the ceiling collapses, Thomas, he falls, but miraculously, he lands on a wooden beam that stretched across the entire factory, like a support beam, and he grabbed onto it, saving himself from falling all the way down. And so Thomas, he only fell maybe 5 feet, so he was okay, but he didn't have a great grip on this beam. He was holding on, but just barely. And so Thomas, he turns and he's looking around at what's happened below him, and he's hearing people screaming, and he's hearing the sounds of people running around trying to help those who have hit the ground on the bottom. And Thomas immediately begins scanning for Charles, and he finds him. Charles was one of the other fairly lucky people, at least in Thomas's mind, Charles seemed lucky, because instead of falling from the roof all the way to the ground, Charles and 15 or 20 other people had fallen right onto that brick structure that kind of made up the main part of this factory. And so Charles had only fallen maybe 10 or 15 feet onto this structure. And so Thomas is thinking, oh, Charles and these other people, they've survived this fall. They're okay. However, the second Charles and the others, who supposedly were saved by landing on this brick structure, the second they hit that brick structure, despite not suffering catastrophic injuries like broken bones and horrible internal injuries, these people on the brick structure began letting out these primal screams, these just horrible blood-curdling screams. And as they did, these loud popping sounds began coming out of their body, and then their bodies began contorting forward, almost like a bug rolling up onto itself. It would turn out this factory was not a normal factory. This was a glass factory, and in order to make glass, you need to heat sand and some other chemicals up to extraordinarily high temperatures. You need a furnace that can literally burn hotter than lava. And so that brick structure that was housed in the middle of this 5-story tall factory was a glass furnace, and it was on. And so even though the inside of this furnace was the hottest place, it was over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the outside of this furnace, where Charles and the others had landed, believing they were saved from this 55-foot fall to their death, was still extremely hot. So hot that the factory workers couldn't even go near the furnace, even with special equipment on. The way they worked with this furnace was with these long metal pokers. They would work the flames and the glass at a distance. And so the instant that Charles and the others landed on the top of this furnace, they began to light on fire. Those snapping sounds that were coming out of their bodies was the sound of them instantly igniting on fire. And so Thomas and the others who had initially survived this horrible collapse watched as Charles and the others shrieked and shrieked, and their bodies continued to contort, and they continued to burn and smolder. And Charles actually, he would roll up so tightly that his body began to roll down the curved side of this furnace, and at some point his body slipped into a crack in the furnace, and he actually fell into the flames inside, at which point he went silent. Around the time that Charles and the others stopped shrieking, a number of people just out on the road heard the commotion, and they came inside, and one of them was Thomas's father. And in a terrible twist of fate, he actually looked up and saw his son clinging to the beam, Thomas, except it was so hot inside of this factory that Thomas was sweating, he was losing his grip, it was really hard to hold on to this beam, and his father watched as Thomas lost his grip and fell the 10 more feet down onto the furnace exterior. He landed feet first, then he fell onto his stomach and his face. He immediately ignited on fire, began shrieking, and then went silent. All told, 23 people would be killed during this roof collapse, and dozens more would be horribly injured and disfigured. This collapse goes down as one of the very worst disasters in sports history. However, on this day, the crowd inside the stadium was so caught up in the game that they actually didn't notice this horrible tragedy taking place just 100 feet away from where they were. It wasn't until the end of the game, when the winning team's fans carried their players in this kind of spontaneous parade out of the stadium to celebrate, that they walked out onto the street and saw all these burnt up, rolled up corpses of the people who had landed on the furnace. In 1996, 21-year-old Katie Fleming was studying French at the University of Oregon. That summer, she was invited to go on a camping trip with some very close friends and some people she had not met before. Their destination was this beautiful spot along the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California, but as soon as they got there, Katie did not take in any of the beautiful scenery. Instead, she fixated solely on 25-year-old James Kim, who was one of those people she had not met before that was going on this trip. And for the people that were on this trip, they would say James and Katie immediately just fell in love with each other. And for the duration of this trip, they were inseparable. And then when they got back from this trip, James would actually move from Seattle to Oregon to be with Katie. And then after Katie graduated from college, the two got married in Las Vegas and then settled in San Francisco. James, who loved technology and always had, was quickly hired by a tech company to try out new technology and then write a review for the average consumer. Basically, James got paid to play with toys, and so he loved his job. The couple also opened 2 boutique stores in San Francisco. One was an apothecary and the other sold eccentric clothing, and those 2 shops were managed by Katie full-time. By 2006, the Kim family had become very successful financially, and they had grown in size. They had a 4-year-old daughter named Penelope and a 7-month-old daughter named Sabine. Katie and James both adored their kids, but James especially was known for blowing off virtually everything and anyone to be with his daughters. In fact, his friends and family would say you couldn't even have a conversation with James if his daughters were in the room, because James would get distracted and just stare at his daughters and then would eventually just leave mid-conversation to go play with them. James was also known to bring his daughters to work virtually every chance he got, even if it really wasn't allowed at this company. On Friday, November 17th, James, Katie, and their 2 daughters loaded up into their station wagon and then drove north to Seattle. They planned on spending Thanksgiving with James's aunt and uncle who lived in the city. And also, James and Katie were considering leaving San Francisco and moving elsewhere, and Seattle seemed like a natural landing spot for them. So this trip served nicely as a chance to see family and to explore the area. And so late on Friday night, after a very long trip, they finally arrive in Seattle, and for the next couple of days, they have a wonderful time visiting with family and having Thanksgiving dinner. On Friday, November 24th, so a day after Thanksgiving, James, Katie and their daughters loaded back up into the station wagon early in the morning. They said bye to James's aunt and uncle, and then they hit the road. But instead of just driving straight all the way to San Francisco, which would have taken the entire day and then some, they decided to make a stop in Portland, Oregon, where one of Katie's very close friends from college was going to meet them for lunch. And so after about 3.5, 4 hours, they arrive in Portland, they meet Katie's friend, and they have this nice lunch. And then afterwards, the family retired to a hotel where they crashed for the night. The next morning, the plan was originally to just get in the car and then drive all the way back to San Francisco. But Katie suggested to James that instead of just driving all day, why don't we just stay here for part of the day, leave in the afternoon, and we'll stop somewhere between here and home. We'll break up the drive one more time. James thought it was a great idea. They pulled out the map, and Katie found a nice family-friendly vacation spot that was almost exactly halfway between where they were and home. It was called the 22-Ton Lodge, and it was located on the coast of Oregon in a town called Gold Beach. And so James and Katie think, perfect, this is exactly what we needed. Katie calls the lodge, and she makes reservations for that night. And so that afternoon, after the family spent their nice day in Portland, they hopped in the car and they began traveling south towards the 22-Ton Lodge. At about 8:30 p.m., the family was still on the road making their way when James got really hungry and said, let's pull over and get a bite to eat. So the family pulls over at a Denny's restaurant in Central Oregon. They go inside, and then after a quick bite to eat, they get back out and they're on the road at 9 p.m. From the Denny's to the lodge was about a 2.5-hour drive. But after driving for 2 more hours, James realized they had missed a turn. So he told Katie about it, they looked at the map, and they realized if they were to backtrack all the way to that turn, it would add several more hours onto their trip. And so they began looking for an alternative path. And they found one. Instead of going all the way west to the coast and then all the way south to this lodge, which was the original plan, they could just go south from where they were all the way until they were parallel with this lodge. And then from there, they could just cut west along this road called Bear Camp Road that would basically go straight to their destination. But what this map did not do a good job of explaining was just how dangerous Bear Camp Road was. It started at 900 feet of elevation, but very quickly went all the way up to 4,000 feet of elevation before it went over the backside of this mountain down to Gold Beach and where this lodge was. While the road is paved, it's incredibly narrow and it's basically cut into a mountainside, and so there's very steep drop-offs throughout most of this ride, and there are no guardrails protecting people from falling off. The summer is really the only time people should be on Bear Camp Road because that's when the road is maintained. In the winter, the road is not plowed, it's not maintained, and so even a light snowstorm could make the road totally impassable. And the road cuts through a very remote section of Oregon where there's just not many people around. So if you get in trouble out there, you're probably on your own. But the Kims were not aware of the dangers this road possessed, and so after going south for a while, they did turn on to Bear Camp Road and began slowly driving up the mountain. And so as James is driving, Katie falls asleep in the passenger seat, the girls fall asleep in back, and outside it begins to snow. An hour later, Katie wakes up from her sleep, and the first thing she notices is outside, it is snowing so hard that James now has the windshield wipers on full blast, and still you could barely see out the front windshield. She looked at her husband, and he was hunched over, white-knuckling the steering wheel, looking intently out the window, and she says to him, what's going on? Should we stop? Should we turn around? And James, without even looking at her, says, yeah, honey, I do want to turn around, but the road is so narrow, we can't. And then he would tell his wife that earlier they had actually driven through a fork in the road where there was enough space to turn around, and so now he was just hopeful that there'd be another fork somewhere that would allow them to turn around. And so Katie was not excited about the idea, but she trusted James and said, okay, let's keep going. And so James just continues driving up this mountain pass, and you got to understand, they are driving on basically a cliff. On the left side, left of James, is just a sheer drop-off, and the road is totally slick from the snow. And so periodically, as James is driving, even though he's only going about 5 miles an hour, he would begin to slip and slide, and he's right on the edge of this cliff. And so it was a very, very stressful ride, and after several more miles of this, they were not reaching any turnaround. In fact, they would have to periodically stop on inclines, put up the emergency brake, and one of them would have to get out and clear branches and rocks out of this tiny little road to continue onward. And so finally, Katie says to James, you gotta stop, you gotta back out of here. That's our only choice right now. And so James put the car in reverse, and he opens his car door so he can look down at the edge of this cliff to make sure he doesn't accidentally veer off of it. And so very slowly, without even applying the gas, he began going in reverse, making sure he didn't go off the cliff. And for hours and hours they did this. This must have been so stressful. But finally they make it to this fork in the road that James had seen much earlier, and they're able to make a decision. They had two paths they could take. They could turn around completely and drive nose out along the path they came in on all the way to the highway, but that was a very far drive, and they knew that road was treacherous and there was a cliff drop off, and it was really just as dangerous as what they had been on, and they really were not keen to be on that road considering the weather. Or they could turn left and go down the mountain on this path that was way wider than the paths they were on. It was like this huge road, and it looked like it went straight to the bottom of the mountain. And they're thinking, we don't know where this goes. The signage is not clear where this goes, but you gotta figure if you're going lower in elevation, the weather will not be as bad. And maybe if you go down this road, there'll be houses, or there'll be a gas station, or there'll be something. But whatever it is, it's probably better than going that way or that way. And so James turned the car and began driving down this new road. Unfortunately, this was the worst choice they could have made. This road they were now on was this long, winding dead end that was used by loggers in the summer. Now, normally, this mistake by the Kim family would have been caught because there was supposed to be a big yellow gate that sat across this road just a little ways past this fork, blocking all traffic from proceeding any further. But vandals had recently come up and cut the lock on this gate, swung it open, and then locked it open. So the gate is completely off the road. And so as the Kims drove past where they normally would have been stopped, they didn't even see a gate. There was no gate anywhere, and so they just kept on driving. And from where this gate should have been, the road went from paved to dirt and full of potholes, and it narrowed considerably. The couple drove for 15 miles on this very tight, winding road that once again was on a cliffside until finally they reached another fork in the road where they could either go right or they could go straight, but there was no sign telling them which way led to what. And so James stopped the car right in the middle of this intersection, and he and Katie look at each other and they know they're in trouble. So they get their phones out and they try calling for help, but they have no service. And so as they're struggling to place calls, one of them realizes it's no longer snowing. It's actually raining, and a lot of the snow on the ground seems to be getting washed away. And so after not being able to place calls for several minutes, they decide, you know what, it's 2 a.m, we're tired, let's sleep here, we'll leave the car running, it'll be nice and warm, and when we wake up in the morning, this rain will most likely have washed away the snow, and we can just drive out of here. And so the two are kind of relieved as they're saying this out loud that this situation is not nearly as bad as it seems, we'll be just fine. And so Katie, James, their 2 daughters, they fall asleep with the car running, it's nice and warm, and when they wake up, Katie and James realize it's gotten much, much worse. At some point in the night after they fell asleep, the temperature must have dropped again, and that rain became very heavy snow. And so all the water on the ground froze, and then almost a foot of snow fell on top of it. They were stuck. But Katie and James, they didn't panic because they remembered when they first turned onto Bear Camp Road, they had seen a plow truck parked off of the side of the road. And so to them, that meant if it snowed along Bear Camp Road, it would get plowed. And so that day, the Kims just stayed inside of their car and they ate snacks and they read books and they kept the heater on and they waited to be rescued. But over the course of that entire day, nobody came down that road. No plows, no anybody. And Katie and James continuously tried their cell phones to try to punch out and get some help, but they never had any service. Also, Katie and James continuously honked the horn in case someone was in the area that might hear them, but no one ever came to their rescue. And so by the end of that Sunday night, Katie and James were really starting to get worried because they have a 4-year-old and a 7-month-old. They cannot be out here for very much longer. But they began to tell each other that, you know what, it's Sunday, maybe the plows don't come through on Sundays. Maybe they just don't work out here on Sundays. And so tomorrow, Monday, the plows will be out here, they'll come by and they will save us. Also, Katie and James began telling each other to reassure each other that, hey, tomorrow, Monday, that's the day we were supposed to be back in San Francisco. And so people are bound to notice our absence and they will report it to police and they will come out here and they will save us. So tomorrow we are going to get found. And so Katie and James, they put their 2 daughters in their car seats and James read them some bedtime stories and then the family fell asleep. The next day, Monday, the family did a lot of the same things they did the day before. They sat in their car, they kept spirits high, they tried to use their cell phones, which didn't work, they honked their horns to get people's attention, that didn't work, they tried to ration their food, and the whole time, they're keeping their eyes up each side of this road they're on in hopes a plow comes through. But all day long, no trucks, no plows, nothing comes down this road. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family's absence was noticed by a family friend, but they didn't report it to police because they figured the Kim family had just decided to stay out a little bit longer and they would be back soon. By Monday night, Katie and James were officially terrified. They were almost out of fuel in their car. They were almost out of food. In fact, to compensate for their low amount of food, Katie had begun not only breastfeeding her 7-month-old, but also began breastfeeding her 4-year-old. Also, outside of their car, bears began kind of assembling and checking them out. And at first, Katie and James would scream and yell and try to scare them off, but the bears ultimately were not that fazed by them. They were not aggressive, but it meant the family did not feel comfortable getting out of their car. And so they're in this very claustrophobic situation where they are literally trapped inside of this small car where all the windows are covered with snow and they can't go anywhere, they can't call anyone, they're running out of their supplies. I mean, this is a terrifying situation to be in. Katie and James had been really strong to this point, but around this time, they began to act scared, and their kids picked up on it, and they started acting scared and fearful. And so the parents were trying their best to calm them down and tell them everything's going to be fine and they're going to get out of here soon. But in reality, Katie and James knew that if they didn't get found soon, they were probably going to die. The next day when they woke up, which was Tuesday, again, no cars or trucks came down either road. There was no plows. The snow just continued to pile up, and the food was running unbelievably low to the point where James actually left the car and went out looking for bear droppings because there's bears all over the place now, and he would pull the berries out of their droppings, and he and Katie began eating those. But after a while, they decided that was not a good idea because they might poison themselves. Their daughters, who the day before had been acting out of fear and anxiety, were now lethargic and quiet. And the parents' response to this was to start fighting with each other about whose fault this was, when in reality, they were just totally scared about what might happen to them. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family had still not been reported to police. And so that night, Tuesday night, the Kim family once again huddled up inside of their car. James read the kids' books, and then they all fell asleep. The next morning, Wednesday, they ran out of gas for their car. And so they had no way to heat themselves. And so James got the spare tire out of the back of the car and he rounded up some magazines inside of the car and he lit a fire for the family to stand around and try to warm up by. And it worked, but the fire very quickly died out and they couldn't find any wood that wasn't soaking wet to put on it. And so before long, they did not have a fire. And so all day that day, James and Katie were desperately looking up the road in hopes that a car or truck would come through. They never did. James and Katie tried their cell phones repeatedly, but they never got service. They honked their horns and they screamed out for help, but nobody heard them. And so before long, it was dark again and the family was huddled up inside of their now freezing car, and all they could hear outside was the sounds of bears marching around the area. And so I'm sure James and Katie thought to themselves, I wonder if we'll survive the night. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, that family friend who had noticed the Kims were gone on Monday, she did go to the police on Wednesday afternoon and reported them missing. And so a search party was being organized that night, but of course the Kim family would have no way of knowing that. The next morning, Thursday, the Kim family woke up, they survived the night, but at this point, James and Katie are speaking openly about the real possibility that they all might die. In fact, Katie says to James, you have to promise me if our 2 kids die out here, you have to kill me too. And James said he would. At this point, Katie and James do not believe a truck or a car or anything is going to drive down this road and save them. They believe their only hope of being rescued is by sending a smoke signal up into the air that a pilot might see. So they pull off all 4 tires of their car, and then they pull everything out of the car that might burn, and they stack that on the tires, and that included Penelope's prized stuffed lamb. And then once they had their big pile, they lit it on fire, and fairly quickly, a large black billowing cloud of smoke was going straight up to the sky, and for a minute the Kim family was very optimistic that they were about to be found, that certainly someone was going to see the smoke and come find them. But unfortunately, the fire burned out very quickly, they couldn't light it again, and nobody flew overhead. And so before long, the family is once again huddled inside of their freezing cold car that night. There's bears walking around outside. They're basically out of food. Their kids aren't even crying anymore. They're just silent and cold and miserable. And as they're all shivering and trying to stay warm, James realizes he needs to do something drastic or his family's going to die. And so the next morning, Friday, when they get up, James tells Katie that he had been studying the map and there's a town about 4 miles east called Galice that he believes he can get to in about 2 hours. Katie immediately said, "No, you cannot leave us. We need you here. There's probably a search party out there looking for us right now. We need to stay together so we can all be found." But James's instincts were telling him that no one was coming for them, or no one was going to actually find them in time, and so their only hope was if he ventured off and found help. And so Katie finally reluctantly agrees to let him go because he seemed really confident. And so at 7:45 a.m. that morning, James gave his 2 daughters a big hug and a kiss, told them he loved them and he would see them soon, and then he hugged his wife and said he loved her, and then he turned around and walked up the road out of sight. At the same time, unbeknownst to the Kim family, hundreds of searchers and helicopters are all over Bear Camp Road looking for them. 2 days later, on Sunday, December 3rd, so a week after the family had originally gotten stuck, a helicopter pilot that was part of the search effort was flying around Bear Camp Road when he noticed footprints in the snow below. When he started following these footprints, and eventually the footprints kind of disappeared under some trees, and then he couldn't pick them up again, and so without that much fuel left, he decided he would just backtrack and follow the footprints back to their origin. And so he retraced these footprints for quite a while until he came to a clearing, and in the middle of the clearing was a car, and next to the car was Katie waving an umbrella back and forth. The pilot immediately knew who he was looking at, but he didn't have enough fuel to actually land and pick her and her family up. And so instead, he just hovered down as low as he could, and he made good eye contact with her to reassure her that, "I see you and we're coming for you." And then he marked on the map where they were. He flew off to the search headquarters, and just minutes later, another helicopter was spun up. They flew to that same location, and they were able to land in that clearing. And as soon as the pilot got out, he saw Katie running up to him, carrying her 2 daughters, who looked like they were in pretty good shape. And she's crying tears of joy, and she's thanking him profusely. And then when she's right up in front of him, she says, "Are you here because of my husband? Did James tell you where we were?" And the pilot looked visibly confused. Katie picked up on it, and she explained how just 2 days earlier, James had left to go to the town of Galice to get help, and he still hadn't come back yet. And so at this point, the pilot understood what was happening, and so he looked down and he said, "No, ma'am, we still have not found James." Katie was devastated, and she cried as she and her daughters were loaded into the helicopter and airlifted out of the forest and brought to a hospital. There they would make full recoveries. Meanwhile, the search effort, which had been all over Bear Camp Road, was suddenly focused exclusively on the area around where their car was. And professional trackers were brought in to look for James's tracks, and they found them fairly quickly and began following them. James, after departing his family to go look for help, which must have been the most difficult decision he had ever made in his entire life. He loved his family more than anything, and he had to abandon them in the middle of the wilderness with no food, with no power, and he has no idea if he'll ever see them again. And so after leaving them behind, he walked 3 miles up the road they came in on, and then instead of just continuing on that road in the direction of Galice, he deviated and walked off the road. He actually went straight down one of the cliffs until he hit a river. And it's believed that maybe he saw the river from up on the road and thought that would be a faster way to get to Galice. But either way, he got down to the river, and as he walked, he would leave behind him little bits of torn clothing and torn paper to create a trail of where he was going, presumably so if he needed to, he could backtrack to his family. And so he gets down to this river, and for several miles he walks downstream. And then after being gone for at least 2 hours and not reaching the town of Galice, he must have realized he had either gone the wrong way, and that's why he had not hit the town, or he had miscalculated the distance, and that's why he had not hit the town. But either way, he did not turn around and go back to his family. Instead, he pressed on, believing he was their only hope. And so on he went, crossing over rivers, getting totally soaked in frigid water. He went up and down mountains all over these totally rugged areas in nothing but street clothes. He had sneakers, pants, and a jacket on. He had no food, he had no water, and he just kept on going until it was nightfall, and he had covered about 10 miles at this point, and he laid down and he went to sleep. And that night must have been absolutely horrible. emotional as he thought about his family that was alone in the woods somewhere. He probably wondered if they were still alive. And the temperature was in the 30s, and again, he's just in street clothes. But he survives the night, and so the next morning, that Saturday, he gets up and he's right back at it, despite the fact that he was physically wrecked at this point. But for him, he didn't care. He was doing it for his family. And so all day he hiked in and out of freezing cold streams, up and down mountains, until finally he found himself at the bottom of this deep ravine next to a river where he just fell to his knees, fell forward, and died. He had literally just kept on going, looking for help for his family until he eventually succumbed to hypothermia. James's body was located 2 days after his wife and his daughters were successfully rescued. It would turn out the town of Galice was not 4 miles away from the family's car. It was about 15 miles away, but that's from point A to point B on a map, like a straight line. But when you actually are hiking in the wilderness, you don't go in straight lines because there's mountains and there's rivers and there's things that get in the way. And so in order to get to Galice from where their car was, James would have had to travel 30 or 40 miles, zigging and zagging up over 4 different mountains. And so this was a suicide mission from the start. James ultimately covered 16 miles through some of the most treacherous terrain in the country, wearing nothing but his street clothes. The professional trackers that followed this 16-mile trail to his body, they called his journey superhuman. The helicopter pilot would later say he never would have found Katie and the girls had he not spotted those footprints first and then traced them all the way back to that clearing. And it would turn out those footprints were made by James after he left his family and walked off to get help. And so even though it cost him his life, James did ultimately save his family. In early 2020, a very popular Russian Instagram influencer named Ekterina Didenko was getting ready to celebrate her 29th birthday. She, along with her husband and some of her influencer friends, were planning to enjoy the occasion at a popular spa in Moscow, Russia. The group rented out a private section of the spa that included a steam room and a small indoor pool. And then once the reservations were made, Didenko and all of her influencer friends began eagerly talking about how excited they were about this party on their various social media accounts. When the day finally came, February 28th, which was Didenko's birthday, Didenko, her husband, and the 8 other people they invited, they all descended on this spa. So they go inside, they go back to their private area, and it's great. There's food, there's alcohol, there's music, they're jumping into the pool, then getting in the hot tub, and everyone's just having a great time. Everyone's taking pictures and filming and live streaming. I mean, it's really going as well as it possibly could be. And then at some point, Didenko's husband signals the rest of the group, minus Didenko, and they all begin to pull out these white hazardous materials suits. Imagine what you would see in a movie if there was some huge chemical leak, a full body white suit with a mask. And so they're all putting on these hazmat suits, and they give one to Didenko, who puts it on as well, and they tell her this is part of her big surprise. Now, it's unclear if Didenko actually didn't know what was going to happen next, or if she's just pretending to be surprised because it would do better on social media, because this is all being filmed and she's an influencer. But either way, she puts on her hazmat suit, and once everyone has their suits on, Didenko's husband wheeled in this huge cooler like you would bring to a picnic, and he placed it right on the edge of the pool. When he opened the lid, the crowd all gasped and laughed and smiled and filmed as these huge clouds of smoke or steam came pouring out of it. What it was roughly 55 pounds of dry ice. Dry ice is just frozen carbon dioxide. It's commonly used for things like refrigerating perishable goods for long periods of time because dry ice stays cold for a really long time. Also, because of the huge white gas clouds that come off of dry ice, it's also very commonly used as a sort of spooky decoration because you have these very cool white clouds going everywhere. And in fact, that's what Didenko's husband planned to use this dry ice for. He was going to dump it into the pool and create those big white gas clouds all over the pool. The reason they call it dry ice is because as it starts to heat up, it doesn't melt into a liquid state the way frozen water does. Instead, it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state. Dry ice is considered to be quite hazardous if it's handled inappropriately, and while these partygoers all had their hazmat suits on, it's unlikely they were actually wearing them for safety. It's far more likely they were wearing them because it would look good on social media and would kind of hype up the stunt they were about to do. And so after the dry ice was revealed inside of this cooler, Didenko's husband and another of the partygoers grabbed the sides of the cooler and they dumped its contents directly into the water. And as soon as the dry ice hit the water, it rapidly began to warm up, which caused a massive, almost explosion of carbon dioxide gas to completely fill the lower half of the room. Now, none of the partygoers are even a little bit fazed by what's happening. They don't realize how dangerous this actually is. And so they're just filming and laughing and kind of thinking this is so funny. And then Didenko's husband actually leaps through the cloud into the water and kind of disappears below. And then shortly after that, two other partygoers would also leap into the pool. One of the main reasons dry ice is considered to be so hazardous if handled inappropriately is because dry ice emits that carbon dioxide gas, which at high concentrations will displace oxygen. So imagine if you're in a very small room that has very poor ventilation. If you had lots of carbon dioxide in there, you would suffocate. And so this indoor pool was a small confined space with poor ventilation. And so the 7 people on the pool deck, shortly after this dry ice has been tossed into the pool, they started to realize it was really hard to breathe because the oxygen was basically being sucked out of the room. And so they were able to turn and actually run out of the pool deck before it was too late. Meanwhile, Didenko's husband and the other 2 people who leapt into the pool, when they came back to the surface, they breathed in thinking they would be breathing in oxygen, but instead they breathed in an entire lungful of carbon dioxide, which in addition to displacing oxygen at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation, it is also poisonous at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation. And so when the 3 of them surfaced, they breathed in this poisonous gas, which caused 2 of them to immediately pass out and then just die, while the third, Didenko's husband, he managed to stay conscious enough that he was able to climb barely out of the pool, and he tried to get to the door, but he couldn't get out in time. Eventually, he was pulled out and rushed to the hospital, but he would later die, not only from carbon dioxide poisoning, but also from having gone without oxygen for as long as he had. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In today's episode, I'm going to tell 2 stories that are each about sort of joyful events or celebrations. But in both cases, they take a horrible turn just because of one small decision. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button to please hurry, come over to your house. You have something really important you have to tell them. But make sure you leave before they arrive. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called Peace and Serenity. On the morning of July 23, 2006, a 74-year-old artist named Maurice Agus paced back and forth near an art exhibit in Riverside Park in Chester-le-Street, England. And Maurice was frustrated because this was supposed to be one of the biggest days of his entire 40-year career as an artist. Right now, his exhibit, his masterpiece, should be full of people, but it wasn't. So Maurice's exhibit was called Dream Space. It was this massive structure about half the size of a soccer field, and inside of it was the sprawling network of small, colorful, interconnected rooms. Dreamspace was designed so that visitors could sort of wander from room to room and be affected by the music and soothing lighting and have kind of an immersive, serene experience. And this was by far the largest physical exhibit that Maurice had ever done. So it had taken a lot of preparation, and naturally there had been some construction hiccups, but it was all going to be worth it because Maurice knew it was about to be seen by a lot of people since it was located in a really big public park. However, before they could actually open, there was still one more hiccup to deal with. This morning, when Maurice had arrived, he'd realized that part of his exhibit had not been set up correctly. So he and his staff had spent the last few hours rushing around to fix everything and add some finishing touches to the exterior. And Maurice knew they really needed to hurry here because making these changes had already taken up way too much time and they were already late in opening the exhibit. Maurice could see that there were guests who had already purchased tickets who were lining up at the entrance to get into Dreamspace. And they looked confused and sort of annoyed about why they weren't inside already. And so naturally, Maurice was afraid that if he didn't wrap this up soon and start letting people in, these people would just start leaving, which meant they would not get to see how amazing his masterpiece was, and that would be just devastating. So at this point, Maurice just stepped back and he looked at what he and his staff had done so far in terms of fixes. And he decided that, things were looking good enough. They'd addressed the major issues that he had had, and even though Maurice was ultimately a perfectionist and would have liked to do even more additions, just getting Dreamspace open at this point was way more important. So Maurice told his staff to stop what they were doing and go to the entrance and start letting the visitors in. A few hours later, around 3:15 p.m., 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings walked into Riverside Park with her 14-year-old grandson. They lived in the area, and they had just decided to take a walk together in the park. And Elizabeth was glad they had. It was like the perfect summer day. There was a light breeze. It was very sunny and warm. And so with the wind rustling her hair and her grandson happily walking beside her, she felt very at peace. But just then, her grandson stopped and sort of broke her peace by telling her to, "Hey, look at this." And Elizabeth turned and looked, where her grandson was pointing. And she saw on the other side of the park, there was this sprawling, colorful structure with a huge line of people out front and soothing music coming from its open doors. And Elizabeth thought, whatever that is, it looked really intriguing and not like anything she had ever seen before. So she was just excited as her grandson to go check it out. And so she said, "Let's go." Just a few minutes later, and Elizabeth and her grandson had purchased their tickets and actually stepped inside the exhibit. And Elizabeth knew instantly that this had been a great idea. The lights were dim inside, and the colorful walls seemed to almost glow as they went from room to room. And all around them, the dreamy, tranquil music played. And even though it was fairly crowded and pretty hot inside, it still felt quite peaceful. And Elizabeth could feel her entire body just sort of relax. And for the next 10 minutes or so, she and her grandson just wandered around slowly, taking in the atmosphere and the lights and the music. It was really nice. At some point, they made their way into this room which had this beautiful blue hue to it. And there was some light coming in from the room next to them, which was sort of brownish. And when the color of the room they were in and this brownish light combined, it sort of had this effect of making the room feel almost green, and then mixed with the music, it was just this really cool experience. And both Elizabeth and her grandson were just sort of transfixed, sort of taking in this really cool exhibit. But as they were taking this in, all of a sudden, there was this deafening snapping sound. And the moment that snapping sound happened, Elizabeth suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented, and as she stared at all the colors around her, the room seemed to almost tilt, and she found herself stumbling a few steps, like the room was moving and she was losing her balance. And at first she wondered if maybe the lights and the heat were just getting to her, except then she couldn't help but have this almost floating sensation, like the room itself was moving away from her. And then she realized her feet were no longer touching the floor. Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the West Coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you got to act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all expenses paid for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. That is fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. The creator of Dreamspace, Maurice, had been outside with the guests who were in line waiting to get into the exhibit. And so far, the day really had been going great. I mean, he had done all those last-minute changes and fixes to the exhibit, and he had sort of got it done just in time to open it up, and now all these people are here, and there's at least 40 some odd people in line with more and more joining, and everybody who comes out of the exhibit is, beaming and talking about what an incredible experience it was. I mean, the day had been going great for Maurice until he heard that snapping sound. When that loud snap rang out, everybody heard it, and then Maurice, who was looking away from Dreamspace, he began hearing screams behind him. And then before he could say or do anything, he just sort of whipped around and looked, and all he saw were these shapes just falling from the sky and smashing into the ground. And at first, Maurice and everybody else around him didn't even know what they were. Then suddenly Maurice realized those shapes were people. So earlier in the day, when Maurice and his staff were sort of hustling to get all those last-minute fixes done on this exhibit so they could open it to the public, well, Maurice, who knew this was going to be his last big art exhibit, this was like the end of his career, it was supposed to be the exclamation point on a storied career here, he was so worried that if he didn't get the doors open fast enough, that people in line were going to leave and not even show up, and it would be this catastrophic failure, that he ultimately basically stopped his staff from finishing all the renovations, all the fixes he needed to do, in favor of just getting people in the door. And the way he sort of rationalized it was, well, I'm a perfectionist, and I would have liked to have done all the fixes, but I did enough. It's good enough. Let's get this place open. Let's send people in. The problem with that is some of the things that he overlooked in his haste to open up the front doors for the public included vital safety precautions. Some of these missed safety precautions included tying down a series of extra ropes to anchor the exhibit to the ground. The staff had ultimately tied down the front of the structure, but, because Maurice rushed them to get the place open, they didn't anchor the back of the exhibit. And this would turn out to be just a catastrophic oversight. Dreamspace was not a regular permanent art exhibit. It was not made of walls and concrete with a real foundation. It was an inflatable exhibit made of plastic sheeting, sort of like what shower curtains are made of. So even though there was just a light breeze going through the park that day, it was enough to sort of suddenly lift the entire Dreamspace structure out of the ground because, again, there was just a couple of anchors, not a full set of anchors, and so suddenly the wind yanks the space out of the ground. That was the snapping sound. And so basically this big structure turned into like a giant hot air balloon, and everybody inside of it, the dozens of people, including Elizabeth and her grandson, were thrown 30 feet into the air, and they're all trapped inside of this plasticky structure that's contorting in the wind up at 30 feet. And as the wind picked up, the higher up they went, the Dreamspace structure, as it contorted, began ejecting all of the people inside of it out. And so that's why when Maurice looked, he saw all these people falling to the ground. In the end, 27 people were injured and 2 were killed, including Elizabeth Collings. As for Maurice Agus, the creator of Dreamspace, he was convicted of a health and safety violation and given a fine. But despite that being a relatively light punishment relative to what happened, he was so devastated by the destruction that his creation caused that he never made anything like it again. This was the last piece of art he ever did. And in fact, he died just 3 years later in 2009. At 5 a.m. on December 24th, 1885, 30-year-old Samuel Wardell abruptly sat up in his bed in New York City, having just been woken up by the sound of his deafening alarm clock. And just like every other morning, Samuel immediately got up out of his bed and he trudged across the floor of his one-bedroom apartment to the shelf where his alarm clock was, and he reset it. Now, the placing of this alarm clock was very intentional. Samuel was a very, very heavy sleeper. And so by putting the clock all the way over there, it forced him to get out of bed, walk all the way across the room to reset it, and then ideally, he just wouldn't go back to bed. And for the most part, he wouldn't. Now, it can't be overstated just how heavy a sleeper Samuel actually was. In fact, he'd actually taken another step to make sure that he really could not sleep through his alarm. He'd made some additional alterations to the alarm clock that made it way louder. Now, this did seem sort of like overkill to most people who knew about it, but it was hard to argue with the results. Samuel had not been late to work in years, and that was really important because Samuel had a very early morning job that he didn't want to lose. He was a city lamplighter. In 1885, large parts of New York City still relied on gas-burning streetlights when it got dark outside. So the way it worked is there was a night shift lamplighter, not Samuel, this is somebody else, who would go around the city and light those lights at dusk. And then in the early morning hours, the morning lamplighter, Samuel, would go put them out again. And so that's why he had to get up early to go put out the lamps. And even though Samuel really didn't like getting up this early, the reality is he did need the job. And also, too, he had sort of grown fond of the job. He had a lot of fun doing it. Over the years, he'd become very friendly with basically everybody on his local route, and so he didn't mind it. You know, getting up was painful, but it was worth it. Samuel actually had become so close with the people on his route that night he was going to be throwing this big Christmas party for all these people. It was like all his friends from his job were going to come over and celebrate with him, and he was really excited about it. But that was not going to be until much later that night. You know, for now, he just needed to reset his alarm clock, get dressed, and go out and put out those lamps. Fast forward to the end of the night, and Samuel now, as he's done with his work, he's back home, all his friends are over, and he's pouring some ale from this big barrel that his friends had brought over for this party, and he's just having a great time. The single room of his tiny apartment was now packed with about 30 people, and they too were all having just a great time. They didn't care how small it was. This was just like an awesome party. Now, by this point, Samuel and his friends had already spent the last few hours drinking, and so they were quite drunk, but they were having a great time, laughing and eating, and everyone's just having so much fun. And so even though it was definitely getting late, and Samuel did have to work the next day, it just felt like the party was not about to end anytime soon, and Samuel was not quite ready to turn it off yet. He was having too good of a time. And so when one of his friends randomly stood up and sort of drunkenly suggested they have an amateur boxing match, Samuel immediately voiced his approval. Along with everybody else, they cheered. They're like, yeah, let's do it. And so Samuel and the other party guests, they cleared the furniture out from, the single room, to set up the boxing ring. And then Samuel and the others all stood back and cheered while two of their friends began, fighting each other in the middle of the apartment. It was like this totally crazy, booze-fueled just madness happening inside of this place. And Samuel was having the time of his life, not thinking remotely about how absolutely miserable it was going to be waking up in now just a few hours when his alarm went off at 5 a.m. He was just doing his best not to think about it. Enjoy the party, that's it. And so for a while, the madness continued until eventually people did get really tired and began leaving, and before long, it was just Samuel standing in his now totally destroyed apartment from this party. And so at this point, Samuel, he looked at his clock and he saw he had, barely 2 hours before he would have to get up for work. And he's thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be so awful. I'm going to feel so miserable. but it was totally worth it. What a great party. And so very drunkenly, Samuel kind of stumbled his way over to his bed. He just fell right down on top of it and he fell asleep. And sure enough, just about 2 hours later at 5 a.m. sharp, his alarm went off. Hours later, on Christmas afternoon, a local police officer walked up to Samuel Wardell's front door and knocked. The officer was there because Samuel's boss had called the station when Samuel had failed to show up for work that morning. And this was so out of character for Samuel that right away his boss contacted the police and said, please, someone needs to go check on him and make sure he's okay. And so now the officer waited at the door for Samuel. But when no one answered, he tried the door handle. And he found it was locked, but this was a very rickety, tiny home, and the officer could tell it would not take much to basically kick the door in. And so after calling out for Samuel a few more times and knocking, pretty loud and still not getting a response, the officer just stepped back and then kicked the door and blasted it open. And so the officer stepped inside the home and immediately saw Samuel. And when he did, he understood why he had missed work. It would turn out when Samuel went to bed after his big party, he forgot to move his bed back into the position that it normally was in. He had moved the furniture around for that boxing match and just didn't put it back. And so instead, he wound up going to sleep with his bed all the way across the room, under the shelf where he kept his alarm clock. And this was like the worst place for Samuel to fall asleep. Because, he had set his alarm to go off at 5 a.m. the following morning, just like he did every day. But his alarm clock was not a normal alarm clock. Samuel had intentionally altered his alarm clock to be way louder than a standard alarm clock. But the way he had done that was fairly unique. He had run a wire between a normal alarm clock and this shelf that had hinges. Basically, the shelf could be situated like this, or it could fold down, basically making it flush to the wall. So it could hold stuff or be flush to the wall. And so when his normal wind-up alarm clock would go off in the morning and begin to ring, it would begin to vibrate and would sort of move across the shelf. And connected to it was this wire that ran to the hinges. And at a certain point, when this alarm sort of got far enough, it would pull enough to disable the hinges, and the shelf that was situated like this would suddenly fall. And in order to make this alarm really, really loud, Samuel had put a 10-pound rock on that shelf. So the instant the hinges dropped, that 10-pound rock came crashing down and smashed into the floor, causing a huge noise that consistently woke Samuel up. But on the morning after his big party, because Samuel was sleeping now directly under the shelf because he didn't move his bed back, that 10-pound rock didn't hit the ground. It fell and smashed directly into Samuel's head and broke his skull. After being discovered by that police officer, Samuel was rushed to a local hospital, but later died from his injuries. Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never-before-heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a